Imagine, it's the morning of the 30th of September, 1975. You're in Rome. It's early autumn. Warm hair, soft sunlight, that golden glow the city gets when summer hasn't fully let go yet. You are in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Rome, called Parioli. Three-line streets, elegant buildings, expensive cars perfectly parked along the sidewalks. It's early morning, quiet, almost cinematic. The kind of place where nothing truly bad is supposed to happen. Then, a sound breaks the silence. A dull, repetitive thump coming from the trunk of a car outside a private clinic. People stop. They look around. It doesn't make sense. What could it be? A dog left in the car, or maybe a radio that wasn't turned off after parking. The noise continues, insistent, alive. When staff from the clinic manage to force the trunk open, the scene inside shatters every assumption about safety, privilege, and who the good families of Rome really are. Inside the trunk lies the body of a young woman wrapped in a blood-soaked sheet. Next to her, in that same cramped airless space, another girl is still breathing. Barely. Her face is swollen, her voice almost gone, but she is alive. That survivor will soon reveal a story so brutal, so calculated, and so deeply rooted in Italy's class system and political tensions that it will change the country forever. The Circeo Massacre was not an isolated crime. It was the product of a toxic mix: wealth, impunity, far-right extremism, and a culture in which violence against women was dismissed as a private matter, especially when the perpetrators come from the right families. Today, we go back to Rome in the 1970s, to a villa by the sea, to two young women who trusted the wrong man, and to a crime that forced an entire country to confront the darkness hiding behind its most privileged doors. But before we begin, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Martina, and welcome to the dark side of Italy. To understand kidnappings and political terrorism that transformed everyday life into a landscape of fear. Aldo Moro, one of Italy's most important political figures, once said, "We live in a climate of real civil war." And that was exactly what it felt like. When I talk about terrorism, I don't mean isolated cases. I mean entire cities living under tension. I mean bombs going off in train stations, courts, banks. But the spiral of violence didn't appear out of thin air. It was the aftershock of Italy's post-war economic boom. A boom so fast and so massive that cities simply couldn't keep up. Millions of people left rural towns in the south and the countryside for the industrial north, and suddenly everything was overcrowded. Schools, factories, housing, the political system, dominated by the same party for decades, promised reforms, but delivered very little. The frustration first exploded in the universities. Italy's student movement, part of the global wave of 1968, erupted because the education system was collapsing under its own weight. Students attacked the entire idea of authority. Consumerism, capitalism, the traditional family, the social order itself. They were inspired by dissident Catholic voices, by Marxist revivals, by the Vietnam War, by the Cultural Revolution, and it's all blended into a radical critique of Italian society. At the same time, factories across the north were boiling. In 1969, millions of workers took the streets and occupied their workplaces in what became known as the Hot Autumn. Entire factories organized wildcat strikes, sit-ins, occupations. For a brief moment, it felt like Italy might be heading towards something revolutionary, or towards something catastrophic. When nothing really changed, the rage deepened. Some groups on the far left became convinced that the state was irredeemable, so they launched a campaign of armed struggle. That's how organizations like the Red Brigades were born. Kidnapping judges, politicians, CEOs, police officials. The most significant kidnapping made by the Red Brigades was the one of Aldo Moro, one of Italy's most respected political leaders. He was kidnapped in broad daylight and held for 55 days before being murdered and left in a car in central Rome. At the same time, marginalized far-right groups, heirs of Mussolini's defeated ideology, launched their own campaign, the Strategy of Tension, a series of indiscriminate bombings designed to create fear, to blame the left, and to push the country toward authoritarian rule. The first major attack, the Piazza Fontana bombing in December 1969, killed 17 people and is often seen as the symbolic beginning of the years of lead. From that moment, the violence became constant. By 1979, Italy witnessed more than 65 attacks in a single year, carried out by over 250 armed groups. The era would eventually leave around 428 dead and more than 2,000 injured. The deadliest attack came in 1980, the bombing at Bologna's railway station, which killed 85 people. All of this chaos was the air Italy breathed when the Circeo killers were growing up. And nowhere did these tensions feel sharper than in Rome. Rome in the 1970s was not postcard Rome. It was a city split in two. The wealthy neighborhoods like Parioli and the elegant avenues near Villa Borghese, where diplomats and politicians lived insulated from the world below. And then the expanding outer districts, raw, restless, angry, filled with young people who watched privilege from afar and were tired of feeling invisible. In these neighborhoods, extremist groups thrived, especially the far-right youth networks tied to the neo-fascist Italian social movement. You could find groups of young men gathering in private clubs and bars obsessed with strength, virility, nationalism, a violent masculinity disguised as ideology. Many of them came from wealthy families. They were the sons of businessmen, politicians, judges, lawyers, people with influence. Boys who grew up believing that their last name was a shield and that rules were made for other people. And from this world, from exactly this world, came the boys who would take the two young women to a villa by the sea, convinced that nothing and no one would stop them. Before we can walk into the infamous villa at Circeo, we need to understand the three young men responsible for the tragic event that I'm about to narrate. The first of the three, Angelo Izzo, was 20 years old and already carried the profile of a seasoned predator. He didn't come from a broken home or a traumatic childhood. His family was stable, normal, attentive. But Angelo was not normal. From adolescence, he showed an early fascination with dominance, especially over women. Neighbors remembered his sudden bursts of rage. Friends remembered the way he talked about sex and power as if they were interchangeable. By 18, he had committed multiple sexual assaults. Some reported costing him few months in prison, others whispered in the neighborhoods where he moved. His classmates remember him as charismatic in a way that felt dangerous, someone who could intimidate. He had a way of making others feel off balance, unsure whether he was joking or threatening. He wasn't driven by ideology. Far-right groups were simply the stage where he could perform the kind of masculinity he worshipped. Aggressive, superior, untouchable. Later, in his memoir, he would describe violence as something he needed in order to feel alive. And that's the essence of Angelo Izzo. Gianni Guido, 19, was different. He wasn't the mastermind or the physical force. He wasn't even particularly intelligent or ideological. His danger came from something else entirely, his need to belong. Gianni grew up in comfort, but emotionally he was fragile. He craved approval, especially from stronger, more dominant personalities. He wanted to be liked, admired, noticed. Around his friends, he exaggerated his stories, bragged about things he hadn't done, trying to appear bolder than he really was. In his so-called friends, he found what he lacked most: identity. In criminology, he fits the pattern of the dependent co-offender, someone who commits horrific acts, not out of inherent sadism, but because not participating would mean losing the affection and validation of the group. Guido wasn't dragged into violence. He embraced it because cruelty made him visible in a way he had never felt before. The third of the trio, Andrea Ghira, was the most physically imposing and the most privileged. He was 22, tall, strong, athletic, born into an incredibly wealthy family with deep political connections. His father owned a military supply company. His mother came from an old, well-established Roman family. Andrea had been protected from consequences his entire life and grew up with a natural arrogance, someone who expected the world to bend around him. Classmates remembered his cruelty toward weaker boys. Unlike Angelo, he didn't intellectualize violence. Unlike Gianni, he didn't need anyone's approval. Andrea's brutality was instinctive. He enjoyed confrontation, he enjoyed the fear he caused, and he had the physical presence to dominate anyone who stood in his way. In far-right youth circles, he wasn't seen as a thinker. He was the enforcer, the one who didn't hesitate. Together, these three formed something exponentially more dangerous than any of them alone. Angelo brought the sadism and the planning. Andrea brought the strength and the intimidation. Gianni brought the compliance and the desire to impress. They validated each other's darkness. They pushed each other past every limit. They were a perfect storm created by privilege, arrogance, misogyny, political extremism, and a society that consistently told young men from good families that they would always be protected, no matter what. And then there is the darkest detail of all, something that comes not from police files, but from Angelo's own writings. In his memoir, Me, the Black Man, Angelo claims that the Circeo Massacre was not their first act of lethal violence. He describes with disturbing calm what he calls a previous murder. According to him, during one of their late-night outings, he and others in their circle, possibly including Andrea Ghira, targeted a young woman who was alone and vulnerable. Izzo says they abducted her, assaulted her, and eventually killed her in an isolated area outside Rome. He portrays it almost like an initiation. Together, these three form something exponentially more dangerous than any of them alone. Angelo brought the sadism and the planning. Andrea brought the strength and the intimidation. Gianni brought the compliance and the desire to impress. They validated each other's darkness. They pushed each other past every limit. They were a perfect storm created by privilege, arrogance, misogyny, political extremism, and a society that consistently told young men from good families that they would always be protected, no matter what. Before we begin with our story, there's the darkest detail of all I need to tell you. Something that comes not from police files, but from Angelo Izzo's own writings. In his memoir, Me, the Black Man, Angelo claims that the Circeo Massacre was not their first act of lethal violence. He describes with disturbing calm what he calls a previous murder. None of this has ever been confirmed. Nobody was found, no missing person was linked to the story, no evidence ever emerged. Many experts believed Angelo invented or exaggerated it to inflate his own legend, to present himself as someone who had crossed moral boundaries long before Circeo. But the psychological truth is what matters. Whether the murder happened or not, Izzo wanted the world to believe it did. He wanted to be seen as someone from whom brutality wasn't a moment, but a personality. Someone for whom Circeo wasn't an escalation, but a continuation. And that pretty much sums up everything we need to know about the three boys. Now, we need to talk about the two young women at the center of this story, Donatella Colasanti and Rosaria Lopez. And to understand the cruelty that was unleashed on them, you need to understand something that shaped this entire case from the very first moment. To Angelo Izzo, to Gianni Guido, to Andrea Ghira, these girls were not equals. They weren't from their world. They didn't come from wealthy Roman families or prestigious schools or the polished neighborhoods north of the city. To the trio, Donatella and Rosaria were what upper-class Roman boys in the 1970s, but still nowadays, dismissively called bore. A term that meant girls from the outskirts, girls from working-class families, girls with little money, girls considered provincial or unsophisticated. In their eyes, these girls were beneath them, unworthy of respect, good enough to flirt with, never to value, disposable. And that social contempt is the first form of violence in this story, because the truth behind who Donatella and Rosaria actually were is entirely different. Donatella Colasanti, 17, came from a humble family in a peripheral district of Rome. She wasn't sheltered by luxury. Donatella was reserved, thoughtful, responsible beyond her years. She helped her family, she studied, she spent her afternoons with friends in public gardens and neighborhood bars, not country clubs. She wasn't naive. She was simply a teenager shaped by the limits of her environment, doing her best to build a life in a city that rarely protected girls like her. Rosaria Lopez, 19, came from a similar background. A working-class family, a tight budget, dreams bigger than her surroundings. She was vibrant, sociable, someone whose presence lit up a room. She laughed easily and trusted easily, not because she was foolish, but because that's what optimism looks like when life hasn't yet taught you to guard every part of yourself. She wanted independence, a job, stability, maybe her own little slice of happiness. Both girls lived in a Rome completely different from the one Angelo Izzo, Andrea Ghira, and Gianni Guido inhabited. They came from a working-class district in the southern outskirts of Rome. It was the kind of neighborhood built from post-war apartment blocks where families lived modestly, knew each other well, and shared the same struggle. On the afternoon of September the 29th, Donatella and Rosaria were simply out in their neighborhood in La Montagnola, doing what they did every day. Nothing unusual and nothing planned. That's when the three boys pulled up beside them, well-dressed, confident, coming from a world wealthier and smoother than theirs. The first exchange was casual, a joke, a suggestion, an offer for a quick ride. And for two girls from a working-class district, three polite Roman boys didn't look dangerous. They looked harmless, familiar enough to trust, different enough to be interesting. So they got into the car, not knowing that the route would change, not knowing the tone inside the car would shift, not knowing that they were being taken not toward home, but toward San Felice Circeo, toward the villa none of them had ever seen. And once the door closed, there was no turning back. And this is where the nightmare begins. What happened inside Villa Moresca, owned by Andrea Ghira's family, took place over 36 hours. A day and a half where time bent, where violence escalated in waves, and where every door, every staircase, every window of that villa absorbed something unspeakable. It began the moment the front door closed. First, the girls were taken downstairs, pushed, dragged, threatened. A gun appeared almost immediately. A .38 revolver, held close enough that the metal touched skin. From that point on, there was no ambiguity, no misunderstanding, no escape. The boys made it clear. The girls would obey, or they would die. Inside the villa, the three boys split them up. Donatella was forced into a ground floor bathroom. Rosaria was taken upstairs into the master bedroom. The separation was intentional. Divide and break. Control through isolation. From the beginning, the violence alternated between the calculated and the impulsive. Angelo tried to turn the moment into a performance. He put on music, loud, dramatic, Wagner echoing through the house, while he tried to blur the line between coercion and seduction. Rosaria was dragged into the bedroom, stripped, humiliated. She did not react, frozen with fear, and that angered him. A slap, a command, a threat, then more. While this was happening, something surreal occurred. A young woman called Susanna arrived at the villa. A friend. She had no idea what the boys were doing. They had invited her earlier, making it sound like a transgressive erotic game. She walked into that house believing she had been called to a party. She laughed, she flirted, she kissed Gianni Guido. She moved through the rooms without grasping the horror unfolding just meters away. Her presence didn't interrupt the violence. It normalized it. For the boys, the villa felt like their kingdom, and everyone else, victims or visitors, were props. The stimulant pills called fendimetrazina that the boys had taken all day made everything worse. Their bodies were jittery, their anger suppressed, their tempers set on a hair trigger. They didn't sleep, they didn't rest, they didn't stop. The drug amplified every impulse. The cruelty, the paranoia, the need to dominate. Rosaria and Donatella were moved constantly. Bathroom to bedroom, bedroom to hallway, hallway back to the ground floor. Dragged by the air, pushed downstairs, pulled up again, sometimes together, sometimes apart. There was no pattern, no logic, just the whims of three boys who treated the house as a maze designed for torture. Hours passed, then more, their bodies bruised, cut, burned, exhausted. They were denied water, denied rest, forced into cold baths, then into boiling ones, beaten with bells, sticks, the handle of a broom, slapped whenever they cried, mocked whenever they begged. Their clothes were in shreds, their skin marked everywhere. At one point, while the girls were locked in the bathroom, huddled, trembling, half-conscious, Andrea Ghira announced that he was hungry. After 30 hours of cruelty, he wanted dinner. He sent Gianni Guido into town. Gianni Guido drove to San Felice and returned with pizza, calzoni, Dutch cheese, suppli, and beer. The boys sat in the villa's large living room, eating, laughing, drinking, wiping their hands on their shirts while the girls, naked, dehydrated, terrified, were locked behind a door, listening to the sound of their voices as if the world outside were continuing normally. There is no detail of the massacre more revealing than this: the ability to eat in the middle of torture. When they were finished, they went back to the girls. Rosaria, already barely conscious, whispered, "Basta, please, stop," again and again. Her voice was thin, faint, almost gone. The boys mocked her. "We decide when it stops." Angelo Izzo later wrote that something changed at this point, that they knew one of the girls would die. And because Rosaria had resisted more, because she was older, because she was the one he wanted more, they became even harsher with her. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally began to drag Angelo and Guido down. They stumbled into one of the bedrooms and collapsed, but Andrea didn't sleep. He walked through the villa like a guard, patrolling his territory, inspecting the girls' bodies, noting their bruises, their cuts, the way fear had transformed their faces. He evaluated them as if choosing between objects. When the sun rose, the violence escalated further. Rosaria was taken to the bathroom. There, Angelo and Gianni injected her with a sedative called Rohypnol, while Andrea held her under water in the bathtub, first her face, then her full body, then her head again. She struggled, she slipped under, she stopped moving. Rosaria Lopez died inside that bathtub, alone with 3 boys who felt nothing but irritation that it had taken so long. Donatella witnessed almost everything. She fainted, then woke up, then fainted again. At one point, she was dragged into the same room where Rosaria's body lay on the floor. And Donatella understood. She would be the next. But Donatella didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't run. She slowed her breathing. She let her body go limp. She let her eyes unfocus. She became still. She played dead so convincingly that Angelo Izzo later admitted he was fooled. The boys wrapped the bodies, one dead, one pretending to be dead. They carried them out of the villa as if moving luggage. They loaded them into the trunk of a small car. Rosaria at the bottom, Donatella on top of her. The trunk shut. Darkness. Then something even more chilling. After 36 hours of torture and one murder, the boys went back to Rome and lived as if nothing had happened. They ate dinner, they drove through Via Veneto, they looked at prostitutes, they drank beer, they spent the night drifting through the city. And the next morning, they parked the car outside a private clinic in the wealthy neighborhood of Parioli. Then they walked away, calm, certain that both girls were dead, certain that no one would ever know. But inside that trunk, Donatella Colasanti was still alive. The car sat silently in the elegant street. A small Fiat 127 parked outside a private clinic. People passed by, doctors walked in and out, residents went about their routines. Nothing about that little car suggested the horror inside. Inside the trunk, Donatella Colasanti lay on top of her friend's body. She couldn't move. Her limbs were stiff, her skin bruised everywhere, her breath shallow, her face smashed against the metal. The smell of blood, sweat, and gasoline clung to the air, and the weight of Rosaria beneath her was both unbearable and the only anchor keeping her conscious. The lid of the trunk sealed out all sound. It sealed out all light. Hours passed. She drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure if she would suffocate first or simply die from shock. But there was something else, something far more painful than the bruises or the closed space. The realization that she was alone now. That Rosaria wasn't breathing, that her friend who had begged for mercy until her voice broke wouldn't ever leave that car with her. Donatella didn't scream, she couldn't. Her throat was torn, her mouth too dry, her ribs aching with every breath. So she did the only thing her shattered body allowed. She moved her hand, just enough to hit the trunk's metal from the inside. A dull tap, barely a sound, but a sound. The first time, no one noticed. The second time, nothing. But Donatella kept going, each weak thump a desperate call for life. Eventually, a man nearby heard it. A faint, rhythmic noise, impossible to place. At first, he thought it was the car settling, or a loose part tapping in the wind. But then he heard it again, a human sound, a plea. He approached the trunk. He pressed his ear against the metal. He heard breathing. He called for help, anyone, someone. The clinic staff come running. They hesitated, unsure, but then one of them opened the trunk. The world split open. A body on the bottom, still, cold, unmistakably lifeless. On top of her, a girl covered in bruises, naked, trembling, with eyes that barely held on to consciousness. A whisper escaped her lips, something between breath and voice. "I'm alive. I'm alive." There was no dramatic scream, no cinematic gasp, just that broken murmur. Just enough for the men around her to understand that a miracle was sitting in that trunk. A girl who had escaped something no one could yet imagine. The discovery spread through the clinic like an electric shock. A doctor ran to call the police. Someone covered Donatella with a blanket, horrified by the state of her body. Swollen, cut, bruised, marked everywhere. She could barely sit up. Her hair was wet, her skin cold, her breathing ragged. But she was alive. And with that breath, fragile, improbable, stubborn, she destroyed the boy's perfect plan. Within minutes, the police arrived. Panic swept through the elegant Roman street. People gathered, whispering, gasping. No one could comprehend that something like this had happened here, in a neighborhood synonymous with respectability and wealth. When Donatella managed to form words, the first thing she said was a name. Rosaria. She's dead. Her voice broke. Her body shook uncontrollably. She held onto the rescuers as if they were the last solid thing in the world. The officers immediately secured the area, cordoned off the car, and began trying to piece together what had happened. Donatella, barely conscious, told them what she could, enough for them to know the situation was far worse than anything they had expected. Meanwhile, Angelo Izzo, Gianni Guido, and Andrea Ghira were nowhere to be seen. They had vanished into the Roman morning, unaware that their crime had survived them, unaware that the girl they had left for dead had saved herself, unaware that everything was about to collapse, because from that moment on, the Circeo Massacre was no longer something buried in a trunk. It became a national earthquake. When Donatella was pulled out of the trunk, the entire city shifted. The discovery reached the police in minutes, and as soon as she could speak, she gave the names: Angelo Izzo, Andrea Ghira, Gianni Guido. It was enough. The officers headed straight for Villa Moresca, but when they arrived, the house was empty. Windows open, furniture overturned, blood on the tiles. The villa wasn't a crime scene. It was a battlefield, and the perpetrators were already gone. The first to fall was Gianni Guido. He wasn't built for pressure. Panic hit him as soon as they left the car in Parioli. While Angelo Izzo strutted through the night pretending nothing had happened, Gianni ran home like a child afraid of the dark. He hid at his mother's apartment, still wearing the same clothes from the massacre, shaking, terrified, incoherent. When the police knocked, he tried to give fragments of excuses, stories that contradicted themselves within seconds. But they didn't need explanations. Donatella had told them enough. Guido was arrested almost immediately. Angelo Izzo, unbelievably, didn't hide at all. After abandoning the bodies, he walked through Rome as though he hadn't just spent 36 hours torturing 2 girls. He drifted through Via Veneto, bought alcohol, joked with acquaintances, looked for prostitutes. He played the role of a man untouched by fear. His narcissism was so monumental that even when the police tracked him down the next morning, he greeted them with calm, almost with a smirk, like someone who still believed he controlled the situation. He didn't resist, he didn't tremble. He behaved as if the arrest were a minor inconvenience, something temporary, something he could talk his way out of. But the evidence was overwhelming. Angelo Izzo was in handcuffs before midday. But the most dangerous of the 3, the one who had shown the fiercest brutality inside the villa, did not stand still. Andrea Ghira vanished. By the time officers reached his family home in Monteverde, he was gone. His room untouched, no signs of escape, no traces. It was as if he had dissolved into the early morning light. And for a boy like him, with money, connections, and extremist networks ready to open doors, disappearing was not impossible. It was frighteningly easy. Within hours, the search for him expanded across the region. Roadblocks were set up on major roads. Patrols were ordered to check train stations, ports, border routes. His name was broadcast everywhere, printed on police bulletins, shouted through radios. Wanted for murder, torture extremely dangerous. Rumors exploded instantly. Some said he had reached a far-right safe house. Others that he had fled to Spain or France with forged documents. No one knew the truth. But everyone knew the same thing. Andrea Ghira was no longer in Rome, and he wouldn't be found again for decades. While the city entered a state of shock, one detail made the horror even heavier. After leaving 2 girls in the trunk, after believing both were dead, the boys didn't hide, they didn't run to a safe house, they didn't scramble, they went out, they ate, they drank, they drove through the center of Rome as if nothing had happened. For them, the massacre was just something that had happened inside the villa, and once they stepped back into the city, life resumed normally. That, more than anything, revealed who they really were. By the next afternoon, Italy was in uproar. Newspapers rushed out special editions, TV crews gathered outside the clinic in Parioli, politicians issued statements, feminist groups filled the streets, ordinary citizens asked the same question over and over again. How could this happen? And how could boys from wealthy families, educated boys with everything, commit something this monstrous? And while the country debated, the final pieces fell into place. 2 of the 3 were behind bars. One was gone, evaporated, and Donatella Colasanti, beaten, broken, traumatized beyond comprehension, had survived long enough to expose them all. The manhunt for Ghira continued, the preparations for the trial began, and the Circeo Massacre shifted from a crime to a national reckoning, one that would change Italy forever. The trial that followed the Circeo Massacre became one of the most watched in Italian history. It wasn't simply a legal proceeding, it was a national reckoning. 2 defendants sat in the courtroom, Angelo Izzo and Gianni Guido. The third chair, the one reserved for Andrea Ghira, remained empty from the first day to the last. His absence hung over the room like a shadow no one could ignore. Angelo Izzo entered the courtroom with the same cold confidence he had shown from the moment he was arrested. He behaved as if the trial was an inconvenience, a misunderstanding that could be corrected if he explained himself well enough. Gianni Guido appeared smaller, overwhelmed, trying desperately to look repentant. But their performances did nothing to soften the brutality that had been uncovered. The key moment of the trial arrived when Donatella Colasanti entered the courtroom. Still visibly wounded, still shaken, she took her seat and told the story of those 36 hours. The threats, the beatings, the gun, the bathtub, the moment Rosaria fell silent, and the decision that saved her own life, pretending to be dead. Her voice wavered but did not break. Every person in that courtroom knew they were witnessing something historic. The forensic evidence matched her testimony. The villa, the bruises, the bloodstains, the autopsy, the timeline, everything aligned. On July the 29th, 1976, the verdict was delivered. Life in prison, ergastolo, for both Angelo Izzo and Gianni Guido. Accused of kidnapping, torture, rape, murder. The courtroom erupted. For many, it felt like justice. For others, it felt incomplete. Because the most violent of the 3, Andrea Ghira, had vanished before he could ever be tried. And this is what became of them. Gianni Guido, the weakest of the trio, would later attempt an escape in 1981. Then another from a semi-liberty program in 1994. He fled to South America, was captured, extradited, and finally completed his sentence in Italy. He was granted parole and later full freedom. Today, he lives abroad, quietly trying to erase his name from the story. Andrea Ghira became a ghost. For decades, Italy searched for him. Rumors placed him in Spain, in far-right hideouts, in South America, even in Israel, in the ranks of the Foreign Legion. When a body was found in Melilla in 2005, DNA testing later confirmed it was him. He lived under a false identity for years and died without ever answering to what happened inside Villa Moresca. And what about Angelo Izzo? Even after the verdict, after the life sentences, after the courtroom gasps and the national outrage, one truth remained. Angelo Izzo was far from finished. He was supposed to disappear behind bars forever. He was supposed to be contained. He was supposed to be done. But he wasn't. Years later, long after the country had convinced itself that the monster of Circeo had finally been locked away, Izzo resurfaced. And what he did next was even more disturbing than the crime that made him infamous. Another house, another isolated place, another family destroyed, a mother and their teenage daughter murdered in cold blood. Same cruelty, same hunger for domination, same Angelo Izzo. In the next episode, we follow him into that darkness. The manipulation, the false rehab, the lies that fool the justice system, and the brutal killings in Ferrazzano that proved, once and for all, that Izzo never stopped being exactly who he was at Circeo. Here, next time, on the dark side of Italy.